Hey everybody, it's Catherine Ewing here from Sacred Heart Alchemy. About an hour and a half ago, I decided I was going to do this Facebook Live, thinking that I had an hour and a half to prepare, and then in the meantime, got two or three phone calls that sort of, took me off track. But anyway, I wanted to get on today and talk about this anyway, even though I don't feel terribly prepared. I mean, basically, my whole life has prepared me for this. So um, if you don't know who I am or what I do, I am a coach and a therapist. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for coming on. Um, and I've been working, and also an ordained minister and an energy healer. And I love speaking and teaching. And so I've been doing all of this in the realm of sort of women's issues, women's transformation, women's healing uh, for almost 40 years now. And of course, it's evolved and grown over the years. And as I've added different pieces and different ways of looking at this and had more of my own life experiences. But every once in a while, there seems to be like a theme coming up with my clients, whether they're coaching clients, whether they're therapy clients, or sometimes just the people in my life who I'm talking to, happen to be having conversations with. And there's there's sort of been this conversation going on this week um, that I just wanted to sort of bring forward because I think it's so important because really it impacts all of us, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. And the truth of it is, most of us are not consciously aware of it, and that's why I wanted to bring it out because it's something that affects all of us. I'm always amazed um, when I start working, with clients and making connections between what's going on in their lives now, whether it's in a relationship or whether it's a job or their own personal health or their own personal habits, that it's sort of very myopic, right? It's this issue, this problem, this relationship, this uh, self bit of self sabotage without a whole lot of connection to what has happened previously in their lives, or whether they have seemed to notice a pattern in their lives around this issue or a similar issue. And this is really where my passion and sort of my sweet spot is. So, again, this came up so many times this week in sessions. Hey, Angela, nice to see you. Thanks for being here. Um, in sessions with clients, whether they, again, we're coaching clients or therapy clients. And I'm just going to back up a little bit and give a little context. So I'll be a little more specific about this. So, for example, when a client comes in to see me, very often on a first session, right, it's about either an issue they're having in a relationship or in their job or in their health or um, just maybe anxiety or insomnia or something that's presenting in the present moment. And so, of course, we might chat about that a little bit. And then you know, ask some questions about family history, right? We sort of back up a little bit and we go back into the family history. And very often, um, what I hear, not always, but very often what I hear is, I grew up in a good family, or, my parents were great. I was a very loving family, or I went to good schools. I grew up in a good town. We were middle class. There was really nothing, you know, in my childhood, that was really traumatic, right? So there's this word trauma that's part of this issue that keeps coming up. What's considered trauma and what's not considered trauma, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And I don't think people are intentionally painting a different um, or some kind of fantasy picture or of their childhood, but most of us see our childhoods as generally healthy unless there's been some really significant um, issues, but generally healthy, generally loving, you know um, generally feeling pretty grateful for the lives that they had. And then, interestingly enough, maybe later in the first session or in the second session, little bits and pieces start to come out. And, some of the things right off the top of my head may be that, my mom or my dad worked very long hours and were really not home, right? They really weren't engaged in the family. Um, More often that's said about the dad, but it could also be, the situation that it's mentioned about the mom. So that may be one piece. So, um, and then there's, oh, but he worked really hard and, he provided for us and that's what dads do. And, he was really good at that. And that is true. That's, often the case. And that's what dads do. And there's also a disconnection from perhaps dad's inavailability, both in the physical sense, in the emotional sense, in the sense of just feeling like a support right there in the family, whatever. So that's just one example. Um, and so I hear a lot of that. And, people normalize. So there's a couple different things that happen. People normalize their life experience, right? Well, this is just how my family was. This is what seems normal to me. And that's just how it was growing up in my house. So then I may also hear that, well, my parents were married for 25 years, but they fought constantly. Or one or the other of my parents used me as a confidant to really kind of cast aspersions and talk about their resentment or disappointment or disapproval of the other parent. So the child may feel stuck in the middle or more like an adult in their relationship with one parent, right? And so their needs as a child are not getting met. Or there may be messages within the family where we don't really talk about emotions, or big boys don't cry, or don't be a baby, or good girls are quiet or obedient, or you know um, listen to their parents, right? So there are all of these messages that seem reasonable enough and may be said not in an intent to harm or hurt a child, but in fact may be giving a very clear message that your emotions are not important. What you feel doesn't really matter. You need to do what I said because I said so, and there's really no room for discussion. And if a child questions or says why or that's not fair, then perhaps the message is quit asking so many questions, you're being disobedient or you're belligerent, go to your room. So again, not because a parent is awful or abusive, but simply in the day to day communication or messages within the family, the child, begins to believe, again, that they're not important, that their questions are not um, wanted or appreciated, that their emotions are too much or just not appropriate. And all of this begins to impact, um, certainly the child's sense of themselves. And because there's no other reflection back to them, usually the parents are, the most critical adults in their lives. The children have no way of discerning whether or not the messages they're getting make sense, are real, are true. They don't get that it could just be the parents, right, reflection, their view of the world. So a lot of what I hear is, right, that we don't talk about our emotions, big boys don't cry, don't be a baby, girls are obedient or quiet, girls are not sexual, right? That's another big one. Any talk around sexuality or feelings around sexuality are often shut down. um, the sort of being cut off, don't be so dramatic, don't ask so many questions because I said so, just go to your room. um, then there are the things about not asking for what we want or what we need. I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience, eat your dinner, there are starving children in China or Africa, or you fill in the country, right? And somehow I could never quite figure out what me finishing my dinner, were they going to pack the leftovers and send them to China to some random child? I don't know, but just sort of comments like that, where there are starving children in China, or don't be greedy, or you have so much. compared to other kids. And so, there's a sense of shaming or blaming again, or dismissing or minimizing a child's experience. Um, and then there's, sort of a use of um, taking something away or withholding something if a child isn't, acting appropriately within the family system, right? Do what I say or I'll take something away. It could be an object. It could be the parent's attention, right? Just withdrawing themselves. It could be their parent's affection or approval. Again, so lots of ways where the child is getting a message emotionally that their needs are not important, that somehow having those emotions or those needs are bad, right? That's they're being greedy, or they're being selfish, or they're being too much, or maybe they're being not enough, but lots of different reasons why parents might withdraw their attention or their affection or their approval. And so in the midst of that, what I often hear from the adults who are sitting in my room is, well, and I mentioned this already, well, that's just the way it was in my family growing up, right? So that is sort of, I don't know, I didn't know anything different, and that was my experience. And what's the point of, I don't want to throw my parents under the bus. They did the best they could. There's no point complaining about it now. And so there's a lack of recognition or differentiation between sort of throwing their parents under the bus or blaming them, or you know calling them out as bad parents, especially if they've passed on, or maybe they're sick, or they're later in years, and what's the point of doing that now, as opposed to the real need for us to look at the places in our childhoods where there may have been emotional neglect, maybe even emotional abuse, or trauma beyond that. And I'm going to sort of sort those things out in a few minutes. So there's the kind of the general acceptance. Well, that's just the way it was. There's no point really in hashing all of that now. Like, I don't want to throw myself a pity party. I don't want to play the victim. And, I'm all for not throwing ourselves pity parties and not being, playing the victim. And there, again, there's a place where it's appropriate to say, you know, I didn't get this, or this thing happened, right? Without going down the well or down the rabbit hole of pity party or being a victim. There's sort of the excusing, or perhaps letting parents or even grandparents, other caregivers off the hook. Well, I know they loved me and they were doing the best they could, right? They just never really said that, or I never really told that they were proud of me, or that they loved me, or that they appreciated me, or I was never really recognized for what I did, or because that would have been, patting yourself on the back, or being selfish, or being conceited, or too big for your britches. And that just really wasn't what they did. They were just hardworking and down to earth, and I just knew that they loved me because there was food on the table every night, and we had a roof over our heads and all of that. So again, sort of an excusing or a dismissal or a letting off the hook, not really wanting to, what I might say, hold their parents accountable for places where they were less than um, compassionate or kind or loving, or um, giving attention or approval appropriately. And again, sort of the generalizing, well, that's just how it was in their generation. That's just how they grew up. And so, I couldn't really expect anything more. Um, and then there's what I sort of look at as confusing the physical needs with the emotional needs. And I've sort of touched on this already, right? So we grew up in a nice house. We were in a nice neighborhood. We got to play outside. We lived in a good town. I went to good schools. We never went hungry. I had my own room, right? I had all of my physical needs met. And somehow that, is sort of like an umbrella that's also supposed to be, well, because I had all of that, then I must have had all of my needs met, right? We don't really, identify emotional needs or psychological needs as separate from the physical needs. And we tend to think that if we had our physical needs met, that we had a good upbringing and we should just be happy and, kind of get on with life, um, with gratitude and appreciation for that. And while we can, again, hold gratitude and appreciation for that and recognize everything that we did have, we can also sort of begin to unpack the difference between having our physical needs met and having our emotional needs met. And so um, I want to sort of make a distinction between emotional neglect and emotional abuse. And um, I worked as a child protective service worker for many years. I worked in the area of domestic violence and rape crisis counseling, and specialized in the area of child sexual abuse. And so, I had um, a pretty strong background in trauma and abuse and neglect. And one of the things that I learned is that even if there's not overt physical abuse or sexual abuse, there can be very serious damage done on an emotional level. I remember when I was at DCF interviewing a young woman who we'd gotten a report about sexual abuse on, and she had never actually been touched. But in her home, the perpetrator had drilled holes in her bedroom walls and into the bathroom that she used so that she never had a moment of privacy. And everything that she did, from getting dressed to using the bathroom, the most intimate things that we do, were able to be seen and observed by other people. Perhaps just the perpetrator, or perhaps there were other people as well. And I just remember that being a moment where I recognized that the impact of this kind of psychological and emotional abuse, this not allowing her to have any boundaries around herself, her physical body, and her space, was just as damaging for her as if she had gotten beaten and had physical scars, right? Had actual scars on her physical body to um, as evidence of the abuse. But her scars were all internal, right? They were emotional. So for me, that's an example of emotional abuse. It was very intentional. It was very purposeful. It happened over time. Um, and she was clear. That's different than what I'm sort of talking about, emotional neglect. And I'm actually going to pick up some notes that I have here for a moment because I want to just read this. So emotional neglect can take many forms. And that can be from a parent having unrealistically high expectations, right? Not, hi, Martin, how are you? Good to see you. A parent having unrealistically high expectations of a child, of not ever really listening to a child attentively. And I sort of referenced this before with the because I said so, or big boys don't cry, or don't be a baby, or you're asking too many questions, go to your room, right? So that kind of dismissal or minimizing of a child's emotional needs, or just need to understand why the parent is saying no to a particular request that seems completely reasonable to a child, right? So invalidating a child's emotional experience to the point where he or she really begins to question themselves, right? And doubt themselves. Am I wrong? Was it not okay to ask for this? Why is mommy so mad at me? Why did daddy just send me to my room? Right? So it's really beginning to plant the seeds in a child in a very insidious way, that, again, it's not okay for them to express emotion. It's not okay for them to make requests of things that they might want. It's not okay for them to question a parent's decision or ask for more information or clarification, right? It's because I told you so, or you asked too many questions, or go to your room. It really begins to plant those seeds of self doubt in a child that becomes so, when I see um, adults who have, and let's face it, all of us have experienced some emotional neglect, right? I mean, that's just part of growing up. Um, but it's when it's sort of persistent and consistent over a lifetime that it really can do significant damage to a person's sense of sovereignty, of being able to set boundaries, knowing where they end and someone else starts, right? Knowing where it's okay to speak up and it's not. And all of that starts to get very confused for a child. One of the things that I talk to my clients a lot is what we don't realize is that our ability to trust ourselves really gets the dial on our self trust gets turned down because we have this emotion or this feeling or this desire, and then the significant adults in our lives are minimizing that or dismissing that, or you don't really feel that way, or why do you feel that, like sort of dismissing it either with a statement or a question, or particularly in the area. Hi, Tina, thanks for dropping in. Particularly, again, in the area of inappropriate sexual behavior, and this is a little outside again of the realm of emotional neglect, but for for adults who have had any kind of inappropriate sexual contact as a child and then had and then tried to confide in another adult about that and been told they must have imagined, you must have imagined that, or that didn't happen, or Uncle so and so would never have done that to you, or no, Grandpa just likes you to sit on his lap, honey. He loves you, right? So the child is having an inner experience, whether it's an emotional experience or feelings about some behavior, and it's very real to them in the moment, and then it's dismissed by the adults in their lives. And the the effect of that over time is that that child now growing into, you know, adolescence and then adulthood really is unable to trust their own body, their own feelings, their own responses any longer because they've been dismissed or minimized, or perhaps they've even gotten punished as a result of expressing or asking those questions. So again, to point to a child where it begins to feel self doubt. And when a parent is not emotionally attuned to a child, because a child really has no sense of the world except what is being reflected back to them by the significant adults, and for most children, that's their parents, they really don't have an appropriate mirror being held up reflecting back to them who they are in the world. So there's not a positive reflection being shared with that child. And so it becomes really difficult, if not impossible, to develop a positive sense of self for the child as they get older. And so when this happens um, within a family situation, um, these are some of the things that begin to express themselves as that young child who was minimized or dismissed or um, shamed or blamed or perhaps even abused. This begins, to happen over time, that they start to numb out or get cut off from their own feelings. Again, as a way, it's almost like a survival mechanism. I can't feel that. I can't know that anymore because when I do, it threatens my survival or my security. So again, we start to turn down the dial of our own inner knowing, right? We have a sense that something is missing in our lives, but we're not really sure what that is. And that along with that there's sort of a sense of emptiness or hollowness inside, like I'm not really full, I'm not really filled up, there's just something missing. We can feel easily overwhelmed or discouraged because again there's never been any space or very little space for us to experience a full range of emotion. And so when we feel something, we can become completely overwhelmed, right? The amygdala, the primitive part of the brain switches on. There's a sense of something not being safe, sends that message to the hippocampus, and then we have adrenaline and cortisol running through our system in the fight or flight or significant panic response, where we just get overwhelmed. Our blood flows away from the prefrontal cortex, and we're not in a place any longer where we can access our higher level thinking, where we can really put together um, uh, a thoughtful um, statement, because we don't have access to our languaging and our higher level thinking. So we can become overwhelmed, or with the other thing is we can just sort of collapse into ourselves and become discouraged. And, I've had clients discussing that feeling of just sort of collapsing in and not having any energy or any vibrancy or sense of aliveness in their body. I've already mentioned the low self-esteem, lots of self-doubt, self-judgment, self-criticism, that monkey mind that's just constantly with the you're such an idiot, you're not good enough, you can't do this, don't apply for that job, who do you think you are, you don't deserve this, you're not lovable, right? All the unlovable, unworthy, all the not enoughs, right? Whatever our own version of this. Or sometimes it's too much. I'm too much. I want too much. I'm too loud. I'm too this. I ask too many questions. I'm too bubbly. I need to tone it down, right? So it can be the not enough or the too much, right? But neither of them are okay. Um, Certainly, we see, this strive for perfectionism or control is sort of another aspect of that. Like if I can figure everything out in advance, right? I'll know how to do it, or I'll know the right thing to say, or I've got plan B in my pocket, right? So there's so much attention to detail and trying to control things and having plan A, B, or C. Um, then maybe I'll have the approval I want or the attention I want, or somebody will say they're proud of me, or they'll recognize my efforts. Um, and so there's this drive for perfectionism, which of course we all know is impossible, right? Um, and everything that goes along with that, the self disapproval, right? The self loathing, the self criticism, the self judgment, as we take in, hi Alicia, as we take in the voices that we've heard our whole lives, and they start to sound like our own voice, when actually we've taken on now the voices of the people who have said that to us all through our lives. And I'll often ask a client, well, whose voice is that? And they're like, well, it's mine. And I'll say, well, does it sound like anybody else? Oh, yeah, it sounds just like, my mom or my dad or my grandmother or, my older brother, who always called me stupid and told me I was an idiot, and, those kinds of things. So perfectionism, the other piece that I have noticed, and this has certainly been written about, when we've experienced emotional neglect or even abuse as a child, we are very highly tuned to perceived rejection, right? We're really, really sensitive to not feeling like we fit in, or we're kind of on the outer rim looking in. We don't really fit, or that we are easily betrayed, or people reject us easily, or we feel rejected easily. And so that, again, that sense of rejection um, seems to be very highly intact with people who have experienced emotional neglect as a child. It's hard to sort out, again, as I said before, because the boundaries are really blurred. What are other people's expectations, and what are my expectations of myself? How many times have you said, or how many times I've heard other people say, like, I don't even know who I am. Like, I just grew up with somebody else's idea of who I should be, whether it was my church or my culture or my religion or my socioeconomic group, or whether it was because we owned a family business and I was just expected to step into that. And there was never any permission or any space for me to really explore who I was in that environment. And maybe when I did, I was smacked down, right? I wanted to be an artist, or I, was more interested in the same sex as gender. as a sexual partner. And so the who you were was maybe never even explored, or in fact, again, you were punished or shamed or blamed, or minimized or dismissed because of your choices. Oh, you can never do that. Oh, you'll never be that. Or artists can't make any money. You need to go into accounting because you can get a job with that, right? So who am I really? And that's harder and harder to figure out when those boundaries have been so blurred. And the final thing I want to say about this, because I've gone on way longer than I thought I would, since this was sort of kind of spur of the moment, um, is that what I have noticed with clients who have experienced any kind of neglect, mental, emotional, physical, psychological, spiritual, or abuse, those same kinds of abuse, often end up living out a pattern in relationships with confusing love with pain, verbal abuse, mental abuse, psychological abuse, and sometimes physical abuse. It's like the wiring, right? The nervous system, the wiring, the patterning, everything that's held in their energy body and in their energy field um, has confused love with pain or suffering, um, or humiliation or shame, right? And it's heartbreaking. Um, and people don't often recognize that pattern. They just know that their relationships haven't worked, or whatever it is. It may be the presenting problem, their anxiety or their relationship situation or their job situation, but there seems to be this um, really dysfunctional um, relationship between what is love and how that gets confused when there's been um, neglect or abuse involved. So I had more, but I think I'm going to stop here. I sort of feel like I've been, kind of fire hosing. Um, so I hope that, sort of gives you a sense of something that we all experience to a more or lesser degree in our childhoods, and how that may be impacting you now in your life, whether it's in your relationship to yourself or in a relationship with someone else, a significant other, or just friends and family, how that might be showing up in your job, how that might be showing up in your health. Um, and just sort of being able to take some time to explore that with yourself. Is there a pattern here? Sort of, can I trace this back? One of the ways that I love to do that is through emotional freedom technique. It's one of my favorite things. And so I just wanted to make you aware that next, on the 15th, so Tuesday night, I'm going to be doing a webinar, talking a little more in depth about some of this, and then also bringing in some tools that I love to help work to begin to break up, right, the blockages and the belief systems that are inherent with, childhood abuse or neglect. If you're local, I'm also going to be talking at a local bookstore here in South Windsor on the 24th. So the webinar is the 15th. The local event is on the 24th. And if you're looking for something much deeper, I'm also going to be running a women's retreat here in Connecticut in August that I would love to share with you, if you're interested. If you are a mental health professional or even someone sort of in allied health, I'll be teaching a couple classes at UConn on emotional freedom technique, the UConn School of Social Work. So if you need continuing education credits, you can, let me know, and I can give you all the details to any of that. You can just leave a comment, or you can reach out to me personally, and I will let you know how you can get involved in those other things. So thank you so much for joining me, and it's nice seeing you all here, and I hope to see you again soon, either online or at a live event, or I don't know, maybe at the grocery store. All right, my dears, much love. Take care now. Bye.